So we live in a global world, and the borders are just really not enough to stop technology these days. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your thoughts on, so we heard about homogenization and regulatory issues. We also heard about the National Academies flipping their position in 14 months on you shouldn't to you should. And I keep wondering if that's not coming from external pressures. A CRISPR baby coming out of China or the UK will and can come to Canada. A technology that's developed in Canada can be sold in the US or somewhere else. So how do you deal with that issue that things are moving across the borders? We can have the best policies and regulations here, but how do you deal with that? I'd just like to hear your opinions.
Is this on? No. Right now. Just hold it for a couple seconds.
Hello? Okay. I'm going to offer up a couple of disjointed responses just because that might prompt other people. One of the things that you'll have seen in the slides were a couple of drawings by an artist. And I had those drawn, and they're actually part of a deck of 12. And I had those drawn for a conference I was speaking at in Berlin. And that conference was called Falling Walls, and it was to celebrate the taking down of the Berlin Wall. And that is the day that Mr. Trump was elected to put up other walls. So you might imagine the kinds of comments that I got after a much longer version of that talk. So one of the things that I have to admit up front is that some of what I'm saying is aspirational. It's trying to enjoin and ask people to think differently about their obligations to each other. Are there scientists who might be yahoos? Yes. If they really want to do something crazy, the easiest way to do it, and I'll tell everybody right now, is charter a boat, or maybe if you're rich enough, buy your boat, put it in international waters, get a really great lab and fly your people in and build whatever you want to build. Now, the way in which we kind of try to mitigate against that possibility is that we believe that scientists want to be revered by their peers, not shunned. Scientists are trying to win Nobel Prizes, not end up in jail. And it's that kind of peer pressure that right now is creating a certain kind of balance. But if you think about what's happened with germline gene editing discussion/debate, it starts largely because China published a paper in April of 2015 announcing to the world that it was in the business, so to speak, of modifying human embryos. But when you actually look at what they were doing, it's work that could just as easily have happened in the United States. There was nothing in the private sector that would have prohibited that research. And at the very same time that it was being published in China, there was a team at the Crick Institute that had put in an application to the HFEA. So within their respective jurisdictions, were doing work or hoping to do the same kind of work. And the work that was published in China was being done in non-viable human embryos. So again, a category of research that arguably could have been taking place here. Why do I say all of that? Because what we are seeing now, not in the context of germline editing, but in the context of somatic cell gene editing, is that it's playing out. China announced in June of 2016 that it was going to have the first CRISPR trials for cancer, and guess what? The US then announced it was going to have the first CRISPR trials for cancer. They're looking at 2 different cancers. China has actually gone into patients starting in October of 2016. In the US, they're still waiting for final approvals to move forward. And in the literature, this is now being described as Sputnik 2. So all of that is just random thoughts to say, yes, there is competition. Yes, there is the sense that we have to move quickly because somebody else will get ahead of us. But in a whole other talk, I talk about the value of slow science. And if anybody's interested in that, there's a manifesto on the website. So if you just put in Slow Science Manifesto, you'd actually get some really interesting commentary about some of the problems in which the ways in which we do science now. And I actually think that gene editing is a wonderful opportunity to actually just call into question some of the ways in which we do science. So sorry for the long-winded answer. Others might want to add.
2 seconds.
I can manage this technology.
Just commenting from a different perspective on the issue of harmonization on regulatory issues. You know, it's a tough question. On the one hand, if you look at the drug arena, there are all kinds of international efforts to harmonize, very advanced efforts. There's to harmonize drug regulation because there's a kind of common agreement that if everybody wants these good drugs that treat human disease, and when you look around in the kind of agricultural food space, to some extent there's an organization called Codex that does a lot of this, but it's not the same, and there isn't harmonization. And you wonder, well, maybe there should be, but maybe not. You know, maybe these are more home, felt issues. People want to control their food in a kind of cultural way that they're comfortable with. So I don't, that's a puzzle. I don't know the answer to that. On the one hand, for innovation, would harmonization be better? Well, probably. But if you don't believe that you want to adopt these technologies simply because everybody else is and you want industry to grow, then maybe not. Maybe there are reasons not to. So that's an answer that's not an answer. But I think in the non-human and non-drug sense, we are at a sense of impasse in terms of harmonization, which is very frustrating to a lot of people. And I don't see that being easily resolved in the short term, because really the pressure is on the people taking a process-based approach, the Europeans, to adjust to kind of a product-based approach, which isn't really harmonization but just kind of change. So that I can't really answer the question, but those are some more scattered thoughts on that interesting issue.
Can I follow that up with maybe a comment? Maybe because I've been thinking a little bit more about this recently. Maybe the idea is that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which regulation you choose, or which direction you use to take your regulation, but take one. And that's the problem I find, that the people I work with in industry, it's the uncertainty of, that's the problem. If you tell them you can't do it, they're going to say, fine, I'm going to go somewhere else and do it, or I won't do it. But at least I have an answer, I can move forward. But it's the uncertainty
it makes it very hard to begin research and development.
Right. Thanks.
Rachel.
So I wanted to build on that as well. So my question, which I think ties in or is impacted by the regulation and ethics discussions we heard today, is around medical tourism. So if, looking at, maybe you call it the end consumer or the market perspective, and maybe we see it a little bit with assisted, what's the word? Everyone goes to Switzerland to die, what's it?
Right to die.
Thank you. So will we see that with this if there is an uneven regulatory landscape, or if there are other drivers that allow technology in China, for instance, to develop and offer testing which is not allowed here in Canada or the US or Europe? Could someone comment on that? It seems like there is a precedent for that potentially to occur.
Yeah, I mean, I can share my perspective on it, certainly, because that's kind of where my brain was going when this discussion started as well. And my work is primarily in the clinical realm, and I do a lot of my work at Children's and Women's Hospital, and we see a lot of medical tourism around assisted reproductive technologies. And there's a lot of discussion on the ethical issues involved with that, and they're immense, the ethical issues which are involved with that. So I do see it as a potential for happening, because it's happening in many, many areas of healthcare, and it's multifaceted in terms of the issues. I guess the only kind of piece of hope that I would have is that we're not necessarily bringing out completely new issues when we think about, okay, people traveling perhaps for germline gene editing, whatever that might be. We've begun to think about mechanisms to address this in other areas as well. We've got frameworks to begin to think about this, and we've got some empirical evidence as well to begin to help us shape our ideas and perspectives. So I definitely think it's possible, probably quite likely, in this more consumerist market that we have, but I don't think that there's not been any thought put towards it at this point.
Just to change things a tiny bit, one perspective that I'm not seeing here today, and that I feel very strongly in my research, is the patient perspective. I think they are, at least within the health sector, they are the consumers, and that they need to have at least an equal voice to the public, for example, if not a disproportionately more of a voice. Most meetings that I go to now, although science formatted, are attended by patients, and they're enabled and very engaged, and their voice is very strong at meetings that I go to. And although it can be variable, obviously the ones who come to those meetings are probably strongly positive for a variety of reasons, but I guess getting their perspective in the room is important.
Yeah, very good point. So I would just say that at least in the meetings that I'm invited to, the patient perspective is there, and as it's been expressed, it's actually diverse depending on what you're talking about. And at the December summit, one of the last speakers was a woman who stood up and in a very impassioned way literally said, look, if you can do it, just frickin' do it. And that kind of got, taken up and played. But by the same token, at that very same meeting, there were a number of people from the deaf community who were very worried that this was technology that would be used to, in fact, eliminate deafness. And for those of you who don't know, I manage a blog that's called Impact Ethics. And after the meeting, I invited that patient, Teresa, to write a blog, partly because she had been trying to access the meeting online and had to complain to the organizers that there wasn't live transcription, so how could she participate in the meeting? Anyhow, the live transcription was made available, and in the end, she did write a blog. What's interesting is she wrote back to me afterwards and said it's the only blog that she's written for which she received hate mail. So it's to say that there are a variety of perspectives out there, and one of the things that's really difficult is to get a better understanding of what is it that patients want and what is it that patients think they're going to get access to. And the one thing I will say, given my work, that I worry about is it's not always clear to me that patients understand, at least in the early days, you'd be participating in research, which means you are taking that step with researchers into the uncertainty, and it's not that you're getting access to the latest, greatest, best treatment. And that's not always clear in terms of some of the exchanges.
Carolina? Yeah, I would like to follow up a little bit on that question on the patient's role, which I think is great and is important. It's a good feedback for us for our next panel. And linked to that, it's a question for Leonard, for everybody, actually on the role of the scientist. So there's a reason why you're sitting there, not just to be disruptive or just because we honestly wanted to hear that role of the scientist. We from my side, I want to just get to know or ask you, the panel, what do you think that role will be? I think from what we are seeing and what we heard during the day today, the comments we were hearing today, there is a much bigger role that the scientists could play, either pushing or just helping shape regulations instead of sitting and waiting for the regulation to happen, but shaping the landscape. So any comments or any?
Yeah, I guess I'm biased, obviously, but I think the scientists have to play a role in shaping the landscape, in deference to what Beth commented on with the patient's role for health things. The patients probably have to have a bigger voice, but the scientists have to be there to provide some realism on what's possible versus what's a dream at this time. I would like to think that scientists could help in the debate around GMOs, for example, but so far we've sucked pretty badly at that, and it's not clear why. Well, I mean, maybe it is clear, but just having scientists involved in public outreach doesn't seem to be solving the whole issue. And I guess in saying it that way, I'm kind of biasing my view, or giving my bias that I think that in which direction I think the GMO acceptance should go. You can either be we accept GMOs or we don't accept them. And I obviously think we should, but we haven't been able to convince the wider public that that is the way to go. And for GMOs are small compared to a debate that's going to go on around germline editing of humans if we come to that point. But absolutely, I think that scientists need to be involved. But I think what we need is a bit of a rethink or a different approach in how we engage the public on that, because what we have been doing so far, at least in the agricultural space around GMOs, has not been working. Not just GMOs, but other controversial areas, like in honeybees, the role of pesticides in honeybee health is also controversial, but it's only really controversial if you don't look at the data. And so, but convincing people that you should take a hard look at all the data is hard enough. So I don't know what our role should be, but it should be there.
So I just have a question based upon something that Francoise said, which is around broad societal dialogue. Can you point to an issue or a topic and a country who has done this exceedingly well?
The country that is typically held up as the poster child for public consultation and engagement is the United Kingdom, with reference to work done by the HFEA. I have to admit on record that I am a critic of what has happened in the United Kingdom. And that's largely based on past research, so I don't know if I should still hold this view. But at one time, they were interested in creating chimeras, and in that context, the science would have been illegal. So the short version is they wanted to do work on what is now called mitochondrial replacement. They did not have enough eggs in order to be able to do the research, and a couple of scientists thought, well, why don't we just go to the abattoir? We can get as many eggs as we might possibly need. The only problem in terms of mixing so they were going to nucleate those eggs and put in human nuclear DNA. The only problem with that is that it was illegal. And they invested a lot of time and a lot of public consultation, et cetera, changed the law, and made it possible to create what they called admixed embryos. The reason that I'm a bit suspicious about what happens in the UK is I actually went and looked at the raw data, and the raw data from their public consultations did not, in fact, coincide, shall we say, with the affirmed conclusions about what the public did or did not think. And also at that time, there was greater transparency than there is now. And the reason I say that is I was able to actually get access to the minutes of the meetings that were held by the HFEA. And in one lovely passage, one of the members of the HFEA, says to the lawyer, well, do we really have to do this public consultation? And the lawyer, in effect, says, well, yes, you really do have to do this, but don't worry, you don't have to actually listen to them. I mean, and this is in print, this is part of the minutes, and so it already, to me, speaks to, an issue that there is this sense today that it's politically correct to consult the public, but it's not always clear to me that the right people are involved in helping to generate the data, helping to analyze the data, and don't have a vested interest in the outcome, but to reflect what is really in the data. So I'm just sharing that that's the one time I did do the work, and I was actually quite surprised to see that there was so much discordance between what the public said and what was reported. And largely it's because the public's voice was mixed and complicated, and that wasn't reflected.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, Floyd.
Aren't we giving a lot of credit to the public?
Aren't you part of the public?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
I'm not sure the public has much of an appetite to understand difficult, nuanced issues. And I have no problem as a scientist trying to help communicate, trying to help do that kind of thing. In fact, I do. But, it's not. I'm not sure the public has a lot of attention span.
Well, let me just offer up a couple of comments, and then I'm going to invite my colleague Sue to say a few things. The first thing I'm going to say is I think it's great that you use the word appetite, because that's exactly what we saw happen with GMOs, right? don't think that the public has an appetite and you ignore the public and look at what's happened to GMOs. And I can tell you, I was at an OECD meeting not that long ago, and it's people from Monsanto that are standing up in the audience and saying, don't make the mistake we made. Now, they may have a particular understanding of what mistake they think they made, but I can tell you that part of the mistake was a fair bit of hubris and disregard. I would also come back to the other comment about uncertainty. Even a conservative organization like the World Economic Forum will say that in order to move forward with innovation, you need stable governance, which is your point about uncertainty. You just need to know what are the rules, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do. And they will make the point, you will not have stable governance if you don't bring the public in, because they're going to be on the outs and there will be questions, shall we say. But I'm going to ask Sue to comment on that.
Yes, great question. Is it on? I think it's also a matter of how we ask people to participate in these discussions, that oftentimes people are overwhelmed by a lot of scientific and technological information that they have a hard time getting their head around. I mean, I can certainly relate. I sat and listened to your talk with great interest, but could only follow a portion of it, and was saying I'm going to suggest to Catalina that in these sorts of forums in future there be a requirement that scientific speakers give those of us who don't speak that language so fluently a short summary of the impact of what you said. I'm certainly interested, but I've got a big hurdle to get over to understand it all. And I did have some genetics some years ago. But back to the question of engaging the public and what kind of forum we create for them to participate. I think this is part of the reason I'm so enthusiastic about some of the alternative approaches that are possible through using things like live theater, where you present people with a shared experience. They experience a play where characters are affected, their lives are affected, their decisions are difficult, and they witness that live on stage and talk about it afterwards. And the characters give people a real story, a real way of thinking about these kinds of impacts in a way that they can speak to it without feeling that it's so personalized that they have to share their own story or that they have to identify their own personal issues, but they can hold that character, that scene in the play up as a thing to talk about that enables a kind of discussion that wouldn't maybe occur otherwise. And certainly there were many people in our facilitated discussions after the play that spoke about the fact that, if this had been a lecture or a newspaper article or a scientific journal article, they probably wouldn't have engaged and thought that they really had something to say. So I guess it's a plea that we find other innovative and more creative ways of engaging people in these discussions. And when you do, I think people really do have an appetite to participate.
So I too spend a bit of time doing public engagement, and I learned a ton about it. And one of them is you have to change just the way you described it. You have to flip it around, and we have to be better at describing not what is it that we do, because as scientists we always have a feeling that if you understand what I do, then you'll be on my side. But that doesn't work. In my opinion, I've seen it over and over again. It doesn't work. So the message I try to send out when I do this is, why do I do this? What's the benefit to you? What's the benefit to me? What's the benefit to society? And the nuts and bolts of the science and the technology, everything else is really secondary to all of that. So,
just from a science communication perspective, Science Communication 101 really is that at the heart of anything we're talking about is a person. And you have to remember that. And it's not about dumbing it down. I was talking to someone earlier who said, I gave my first presentation and I really didn't dumb it down enough. And I said, it's not about dumbing it down. It's about making it accessible to people and engaging with them and helping them to understand why they should care. What is in it for them? At the heart of everything, we all want to know what is in it for us. And the other comment I would make is that many, many people in this room and in research have been funded by taxpayer dollars. So that public has a right to know and has a right to be involved and engaged. So, other questions? Kevin?
I'd like to bring up the topic of vanity medicine. There's a great deal of money that's being made by people doing all sorts of things that really have no health benefits, but they enhance people's lives. And I can see this gene editing technology evolving from something that corrects diseases, which I think all of us would agree is a good thing, but then eventually be going to enhancing maybe somebody's intelligence or the way they look, or modifying this and that. So I'm wondering, how do we handle a transition from that early stage of correcting diseases to something that is more vanity-based, and there's a lot of monetary impact there.
Plastic surgery would be the equivalent, I think, and once those operations get approved, there's not going to be anything to stop people who have money to go to those people who want their money in exchange for that. I don't see a way to draw a line easily between vanity versus disease.
So one of the things that's interesting in terms of the difference between the report that comes out in February 2017 and the statement that was issued in December 2015 is that both of those documents make a statement to the effect that it's very important to consult with the public. But the first document, which is the one I put the text up for, says that we need to talk to them about whether or not we should be going into the germline. The second document, February 2017, says that we've solved that question. It's okay to go into the germline. So the question you need to go to the public with is whether or not you should cross the line between therapy and enhancement. And they're explicit in saying, and that question should apply to both somatic and germ cells. So one of the things that I've said in response to that is I actually describe that shift in the discussion as a sleight of hand. And the reason I do that is because I actually think at the end of the day, although I understand and appreciate the concern you're raising, the problem with saying to the public that the real issue is the distinction between therapy and enhancement rather than the distinction between somatic and germline is at the end of the day there is no distinction between therapy and enhancement that can be made. And the reason for that is that something that you might describe as an enhancement, I could describe back to you as it's supportive of my mental health, such that I can have a reasonable quality of life. And the classic example we use in teaching around that is growth hormone. You could be of short stature, and it's completely expected because of your genetics and who your parents are. Or you could be of short stature because you have an underlying disease. It would be a very strange world that would say, well, I'll treat you because I can find a genetic disease, and I'm not going to offer you any kind of intervention because you don't have a problem. And yet we live in a world where we know that people of short stature are discriminated against. So if we are trying to help people, why would we draw the distinction because we're able to call one a therapy and one an enhancement? So the reason I refer to that shift as a sleight of hand is they all know, because I know who these authors are, that they too don't even believe there is that distinction. So it's a little bit spurious to kind of say, let's have a conversation about a distinction that they're well skilled at then saying, well, it's really not a difference.
And I think just the one thing I would add to that as well is that I actually don't think that this is a new discussion and a new concept. So I did some work with the National Society of Genetic Counselors on this specific topic, and we had kind of 500 of them look at these issues, and we had a series of case studies on using germline editing for what we might think of enhancement or what we might think of preventing genetic disease. And there is that very grey line when you get to things like enhancing cognitive abilities or enhancing height, or whether you think of deafness as a disease or not as a disease. People will differ in their opinions on this, but I don't think this is a new discussion. We've been having this discussion in the genetics community for decades, and it came up with PGD, and it came up with other areas, and so we have some tools at our disposal to try and think through these issues, and I don't think that they are necessarily new. Sure, we can maybe do them quicker or more easily or more cheaply, but the issues themselves from the ethics standpoint, I think, are the same.
Kate.
Thank you. You answered my question about third boundaries already, but I had another one, and it's about international governance. Who can best provide that kitchen, given the importance of how the questions are framed and the ability to shift that? What organisations and who can best provide that?
Well, conclusion number 4 from the summit was a call for an ongoing forum, and the summit was actually sponsored by the National Academy of Science and National Academy of Medicine in the United States, the UK Royal Society, and the Chinese Academy of Science. And part of what happened at the end of the meeting is that we had actually set a challenge for those 4 academies to continue the conversation, because part of our message was that this is the beginning, not the end, and that we shouldn't look at the end of this or the statement as a conclusion, but rather as an invitation to continue. China is supposed to be the next place to have the summit. It's anticipated it'll be sometime next year, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how that gets managed, because there will be issues of language, there'll be issues of participation, there will be issues of governance that will come up. But my point is, our suggestion had been to start with the kind of learned societies, if you will, and I'm not saying that that's the right place to start. I'm just saying that was the conclusion, or that was the recommendation we made. And in part, it's because we didn't want it to go to individual governments, because it's not clear to me that individual governments reflect the will of the people in any meaningful sense around this. We also didn't want it to go to established organizations. In the lead up to the summit, UNESCO had announced in October of 2015 that there should be a ban. The Council of Europe in December had reminded its 29 treaty signatories that they had signed on to a moratorium. A number of other sort of these international organizations were already positioned in the debate, and so we were trying to say, is there a space to create a forum where everybody could participate? And there were a lot of flaws with the meeting that happened in December of 2015 in terms of issues of accessibility and participation and diversity. The hope was that you learn from that and you do better the next time. And imagine just trying to start a conversation. So, Marshall McLuhan told us it's the global village. Well, we don't even know how to talk to the people next door, however we understand that concept. So I don't have a ready answer for you, except to say that our thoughts were, don't try to use anything that exists. Try to find a new way to go forward.
Carolina? Kate, can you turn your microphone on?
Okay. So more of a comment, but I would like to get your feedback on these, and is more targeted to the regulatory side of things. So it seems to me, after the whole day listening to the presentations and everything, and in particular one comment that Lauren Risberg made in his presentation, saying that it's not much about what are we able to do in terms of scientific approaches. We can do a lot with CRISPR, but in certain cases we're just doing what we can do and what the regulatory landscape is allowing us to do. It seems to me that, if we think about social benefits, so is society just will have to wait for the benefits just because regulatory are not ready to be at the speed? Or are we just, as you say, maybe China or some countries in the world might have other regulatory landscapes where innovation can be adopted faster? So maybe your thoughts on that.
Well, that's a tough question. Of course you can take the perspective that there are many more things that can happen. You hear this all the time. Regulators are stifling innovation. They're so slow they don't even understand it. Isn't this terrible? You could take the opposite or an inverted view that say, look, the regulators is kind of a deliberative process. They bring in different stakeholders depending on who those people are. We think about this on a social, a wide social, we weigh the benefits and risks, we take comments, it's very slow, with different countries, but we all have processes which drive people crazy because they move glacially. But somebody mentioned slow science or something before. Maybe this is a good thing, because instead of just releasing, CRISPR mosquitoes to, get rid of malaria or whatever it is, or the Nantucket, Lyme disease issue, we actually think about this and what this will mean and what the possibilities. So, I don't know that there's an answer to that question. I realize it's frustrating. I'm somebody, I have positive hope for regulation because I think it can be responsive and modified. It's very imperfect, so don't everybody start screaming at me. But I think we need a mechanism for weighing these developments in a broader sense. We don't have, I mean, you were talking about germline gene editing, we don't have good mechanisms to weigh them. We do have regulatory frameworks which are not necessarily perfect, have lots of flaws, but they do provide a forum for putting in comments. You know, in a longer version of this talk, I end with, if you think about, for example, labeling in the US, lots of ugly, disruptive debates over the years, misunderstandings, states doing different things. In the end, we have a very imperfect labeling law that's approved. In a way, that shows that in some slow and ungainly way, the process works in hearing lots of different perspectives and finding something that we can sort of socially come together on. So I don't think there's an answer to that question. I think there are many different perspectives, but I wouldn't give up faith in regulation as a whole.
Most of my work is in women's reproductive health, and I would just remind the audience that it was regulators that kept thalidomide out of the United States.
Rachel? So maybe moving to a hopeful note and touching on the regulation discussion just now and the public engagement before that. I was at an OECD meeting in the fall and kind of kept up on some of that work, and it seems to me that, and I guess I've been on panels with people that have been impacted by GMO. They've had the big companies come in to where they're living, their countries, and they haven't seen, it hasn't been a very positive experience. And I wonder whether the public sees or has different feelings about private sector driven innovation, or innovations that are seen to be driven for private sector good versus innovations that are driven for public sector good. And I'm thinking now about work Target Malaria is doing regarding a GE, or gene edited mosquito, in Africa and other parts where malaria is, right? And my understanding is that they've taken a very proactive and hopefully considered approach to public engagement, not just with the public, but also with regulators. And my understanding is that it seems quite hopeful that there is a real sense from the public that there is public good to be had from considering gene-edited mosquitoes. So I wonder if maybe we bring the public good and the benefit will change that dialogue and will allow innovation to proceed, or at least be piloted there.
So a few thoughts there, I think. One is the mosquito example is a good one. I think the corollary is the golden rice one, where it was, I don't think the big agri-tech companies were involved, or it didn't seem like they were, and it was done for the public good, but because it was, okay, maybe not get into that argument, but it was a GMO, so it was rejected basically because it was a GMO, rejected by the public. So yeah, maybe the gene-edited mosquito will, or maybe they learn lessons from that and will be able to get more public acceptance. But I think it also speaks a little bit to the framework we've built up as a society and what it takes to get something from one of our labs into the marketplace. Like in agriculture, the hurdles are relatively low compared to medicine. But when you're talking about $500 million to get a drug to market, NIH and Genome Canada, I don't think it's going to fund that, are they? So there you need the private, and then in the public's eyes, you kind of lose all of that public good, so maybe it needs a big change in the way our whole regulatory framework works, and the hurdles that people have to go through, or else we, as a society, have to collectively decide that these are things that we need to fund as a society and not depend on private businesses to do it. But that would also either mean a whole lot higher taxes, or we give up on other things that we pay for through our taxes. system. So I don't know what the answer is there, obviously, but the golden rice thing was pretty shocking to people, I think, and hopefully that tide has changed.
Just a question on the golden rice. Did that live up to the promise, though? I mean, my understanding was that it actually did not.
I think in terms of the beta carotene it was delivering to people, it absolutely did. I haven't really followed the story for the last couple of years, so I'm not an expert to be able to comment on that. But I think what was very clear was that it was rejected by the public far, far before any benefit, the benefit that it could have delivered could have even been measured, let alone actually start trying to measure it.